Open your Bibles, if you will, to Isaiah chapter 63, and we're going to take a look at chapters 63 and 64. And most commentators believe on this scripture. Have you ever heard anybody say that in class? We had a man, one place that I attended for a while, almost every comment he made in class, he prefaced with that. And every time he said something, I got ready to disagree with him. I read several commentators on this trying to prepare for this, and most of them I just threw away because they weren't worth the paper they were written on. Commentators will have a view of the Bible that is completely false. For example, Calvinists, premillennialists, something like that, and then they take a bigger hammer if they have to and drive that round peg in a square hole, and take a scripture that completely doesn't mean what they think, and they'll make it fit in their pattern somehow. And of course, I realized that I looked for the Truth series commentary on Isaiah, and then it hit me. My father-in-law is still writing that one, so of course, when he finishes his, it will be the be-all to end-all commentary. I'm not biased at all. But in my never-to-be-humble opinion, chapter 63 and 64 should not have been divided with a chapter division. Either that, or they should have divided it between verse 14 and 15 of chapter 63. But I kind of think they're both one chapter. These chapter divisions are sometimes very unfortunate, but there's a prayer that begins in verse 15 of chapter 63 and continues pretty much down to the end of chapter 64, and they split that prayer up with this chapter division, and I just disagree with that. So with that said, let's just start taking a look at the scriptures. And would somebody read the first 6 verses for us? I'm going to do differently than Wayne. We're going to take it a little chunk at a time. Somebody read the first 6 verses, whoever's got it. Okay?
Who is this who comes? This one who is I looked at there.
Okay. Some have tried to ascribe this to Judas Maccabeus and various other people. Now Judas, who's sometimes known as Judas the Hammer, he lived during the period of the intertestamental period when God was silent, and he led the Jews in an uprising which ultimately failed. And then there are others that ascribe this to various other figures. Some of them take this all the way out to the book of Revelation and ascribe some of this to some of the figures that we see in the book of Revelation. Those are basically the commentators that I'm throwing in the trash can. This doesn't have anything to do with Revelation. Now, there are clearly some similarities in the kind of language that is used in apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament and the apocalyptic literature of Revelation. Daniel is largely apocalyptic literature, and if you want to understand Revelation, you need to understand the book of Daniel. and the apocalyptic visions that he has in there to understand that type of literature. But that doesn't mean that Daniel is talking about what's going to happen in Revelation, and so on and so forth. Actually, this particular text bears a strong resemblance to what is said in chapter 34, verses 1 through 7. Somebody turn to Isaiah 34 and read verses 1 through 7 for us.
Draw near, O nations, to hear, and listen, O peoples. Let the earth and all it contains hear, and the world and all that springs from it. For the Lord's indignation is against all the nations, and his wrath against all their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to slaughter. So their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench. And the mountains will be drenched with their blood, and all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll. And their hosts will also wither away, as a leaf withers from the vine, or as one withers from the fig tree. For my sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom, and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is sated with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has sacrificed in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom.
Okay, that's good enough. I had verse 7, but that's good enough. We got the picture here, I think. What we see here is a conquering king who's coming back with his clothes all stained with the blood of his enemies. Now, some have tried to make this into Jesus Christ. But whose blood was Jesus stained with? His own when he went to the cross, not the blood of his enemies. And so this is not referring to that. That's, again, you got to shave some off of that round peg to get it in that square hole to try to make Jesus fit this. But this is God. And what is God doing here? He's going down to Edom. Now, who was Edom? Who were they descended from? Esau. And who was Esau? The brother to Jacob, who was named also Israel. Okay? So the Edomites were the brothers of the Israelites. Not a closer relationship you can get. But when the Chaldeans came in and destroyed Jerusalem, it was the Edomites, or the Idumeans as they are also called, that said that encouraged the Chaldeans to raise the temple to the ground and burn the entire city with fire and leave not one stone upon another. And they were very joyful in the destruction of their brothers. And so this image of God coming up from Edom as a conquering king with their blood all over his robe is a symbol of God destroying the enemies of his people. Now, were all Israelites included as God's people? Initially they were, but very shortly they fell away. And we're going to read a little bit about their rebellion and so on and so forth in the verses to come. But they fell away. And all God really has at this time is a remnant. But really when we look at the story of Israel, don't we really see the story of God's dealings with mankind from the beginning of time? God put man on this earth. He gave man everything he needed. He walked with man in the cool of the evening, and what did man do? He rebelled. Then man began to have children. And one of those children was a righteous man, Abel, and his unrighteous brother Cain murdered him. Then Cain went off and formed his own clans and married and raised his own kids. And the last thing we read about Cain was it his grandson or great-grandson Lamech? He's boasting that I killed a man for this and a young, right now it just escapes me what it was, but and a young boy for this. I'm a murderer and I'm proud of it. And that was the way Cain's descendants turned out. Then we get down to the time of Noah, and how many righteous people were there? And possibly not his family were that righteous. Because we read after the flood of what Ham did to the father when he saw the father drunk and he was laughing at him. That wasn't a respectful thing to do. And Ham didn't seem to be too concerned with that, just from what we can read. And it's very sketchy. But, and so maybe not all of his family even were righteous, but his family were the only ones saved out of all the people on the earth. And we don't know how many there were at that time. But there were probably several thousand, because in that period of time, man could have multiplied that and more. So here we have a remnant left. And so God then brings the remnant along, and what happens to the remnant when they start to multiply? We come to the Tower of Babel, or as Wayne says, the Tower of Babylon, as it's actually named, I guess. And man doesn't want to do what God wants him to do again. So God has to scatter the people out over the earth. Then we come down to where there's one man, Abraham, who's the remnant. God has always only had a remnant, and that's the way it is here. It's not all of Israel that's being talked about here. It's the faithful of Israel. But God says, I have trodden down the winepress alone. Why? Because there is no one else who was willing to stand with me to do it. Now you think about the history of Israel. God told them, you go in and you take the land. You either drive out or kill every one of the Canaanites. And you possess the land yourselves. And what did they do? They didn't do it. They wouldn't stand with God to do what He told them to do. And so then God left the people there as thorns in their sides to vex them and cause them problems. Because that was their choice. And now we see here again, God is having to do His own, you might say, dirty work by Himself. Because He alone is able to do it. Nobody else is willing. But what we see here, ultimately, is that God is in control. His will is going to be done. Just like what Esther was told by her uncle, Mordecai. I knew I'd get the names, I just had to go about it backwards. Mordecai said to Esther, you know, God is going, if you do not go into the king to save your people, God will raise up another who will save His people, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows if thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? More powerful words have never been spoken, I think, than those. Who knows if thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? But God is going to get His will done, one way or the other. It's my choice whether I'm going to be the instrument of doing that will or whether somebody else is. And I'm going to be destroyed, and they're going to get the credit. Idumea here is really representative, I believe, of God's judgment on all of Israel's enemies. In Psalm 137, in verse 7 specifically, we see the reference to them urging the Chaldeans to destroy, to raise Jerusalem to the ground and completely destroy and burn the temple so that it is not likely to ever be rebuilt, and taking great glee in the destruction of their brethren. So moving on to verses 7 through 14. Someone read those verses for us. Whoever has it. 63, 7 through 14. Not the same people all the time, please. Somebody else read. Go ahead, Dennis. Dennis. Thank you, Tom.
Praise all that the Lord has granted us. Great goodness to the house of Israel, according to the abundance of His steadfast love. For He said, surely they are my people, children who will not deal falsely. All their afflictions He was afflicted. His presence saved them. His love and His pity He lifted them up and carried them all the days of old. For he turned the leader and himself fought against them. Of Moses and his people. Where is he who brought them up out of the sea? Where is he who put in the midst of them his Holy Spirit, who caused his glorious arm to go? Who divided the waters before them to make for himself a land? Who led them through the depths, like a horse in the desert they did not swim, like livestock that go down into the valley. The Spirit of the Lord leads them back.
Okay? This is actually from what, and here again I got this from some commentaries, men who supposedly know Hebrew. I don't. But this is written in the style of an Old Testament hymn. And so it was probably a song that was actually sung. In this song, we see that God's mercy is acknowledged, His great, abundant mercy. We see that He chose the Israelites to be His people. And the song is kind of pleading with God to continue to show His mercy toward them because of these things. And it tells about how He really grieves for them through their trials. God does not take pleasure in the destruction of His people. But, just like the parent who's just about to light into his child with a belt, and he says, "This is going to hurt me more than you." Never did understand that until I became a parent. And it's worse when you're a grandparent, when you have to discipline them. But you have to. God had to discipline His children, and we have to discipline ours. But God does not take pleasure in that. But because they're rebellious, verse 10, He had to discipline them. But He never, throughout all of this, forgot the promise that He made to them through Moses. And that was that they would be His people, and that He would preserve them. And the righteous among them, even though they might be suffering with the wicked, and the righteous always suffer along with the wicked when God brings His punishments, they need to remember that in the end, they're going to be vindicated. And you might think of the story of Jeremiah, and that Jeremiah never got any peace throughout his whole life. Even when finally the Babylonians were ready to come in and take Jerusalem, and the Babylonian king had heard of Jeremiah and had heard that Jeremiah was one who was counseling the people, give in to the Babylonians, give up, and don't fight them because this is God's will. And the Babylonian king would have treated Jeremiah well. But when he did finally come in, they kidnapped Jeremiah and they ran him down to Egypt, and they continued to torment him for the rest of his days. He never got any peace. But Jeremiah got the victory in the end. And his enemies got the ultimate punishment because he was faithful to God. In verses 11 through 13, we see a brief history, very brief nutshell history of His deliverance of the children of Israel, how He brought them through the Red Sea, got them out of Egypt, are the things that are really being referred to here. But many times He did this same thing in principle for them, delivering them from their enemies over and over and over again. But then they rebelled again, and He had to discipline them again, and so on and so forth. And parents, parents of younger children, especially, I guess, when they keep going back to do the same thing over and over again, you might think about God, especially through the period of the Judges, and how He kept just having to do the same thing to His children over and over again, because they never seemed to learn the lesson. Now, finally, when Babylon came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem and took them all away captive, they finally got the message about one thing, and that was idolatry. You never saw idolatry among the people of Israel after that. And even in Jesus' day, after 400 years of silence, idolatry was not tolerated among the Jews. They finally got that message, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." So it took a lot of discipline to get that point across. In verse 14, God leads them down into the valley, and as a shepherd might lead his beasts or his flock, and there He gives them rest. And that's what's going to happen to God's righteous. He is going to lead them down into a valley of peace. Has anybody got any comments before we move on? If not, then let's read verses 15 through 19. And this is the beginning, as I say, of this prayer on behalf of the faithful people of Israel. Anybody? Go ahead. Thank you.
Look down from heaven and see from your lofty feel in your mind. Our Redeemer.
Okay. What version were you reading from, by the way? What translation? Holman's, okay. That's it, okay. All right. I like, yeah. Let me say this. My two that I would call my favorites that are currently readily available would be the New King James or the New American Standard. But my favorite is the American Standard because that's the one I'm most used to. That's the only reason. But that one is a good translation, I think. All translations are good for something. Some of them are good for being commentaries. But they're all good for something. I just try to have several different ones and read from different ones so that I really get a better understanding of what's going on, because all of them have a bias, one way or the other. So take that for what it's worth, which is not much. He begins in verse 15 here by making an appeal due to God's former mercies. God has looked down upon them in His zeal and His strength in the past. He has showered upon them His mercies, and won't you continue to do that, Lord? Won't you continue? In verse 16, basically the message here is that they are still His children even though they really deserve to be disowned. I think... I can't remember the name of that guy that was the well-known serial killer, and everybody really hated him except his mother. And she just couldn't believe that he did any of the things that he was found guilty of, even though there was hardcore evidence that convicted him. She would not accept his guilt because she loved him too much, and she would not disown him, and she would not, And God's mercy toward us is similar to that in that He never stops loving us even when He disciplines us for our sins. He's trying to get us to do what's right. He's not trying to push us away. But they should have been disowned a long time ago. But God still holds them as His people, and they're still the ones through whom the Messiah is going to come. The fact that His enemies had possession of the land, had placed His people, and that He had placed His people in that land, and then taken it away from them and given it to His enemies, is what I mean to say. He has His name on that land, and the appeal here is that pretty soon, God, if you don't remember your people and restore us in there, the world is going to look upon this and you're going to be a hiss and a byword. They're going to think you didn't have the power to keep on with your plan, that your plans fell through. And Moses, or was it Joshua, when they entered into the land, it was Joshua, when they entered into the land and they went up against Ai and they failed the first time and Ai fell down and all the people were crying, and Joshua came to God and he prays to God and he says, Lord, you've brought us into this land and now we've been defeated, and what are we going to do? What are you going to do for your name? The peoples of this country are going to look upon us and they're going to say, this God brought them into the promised land and then He didn't have the power to give it to them. Why did this happen? And of course God answers him, there's sin in the camp. That's why it happened. It wasn't my fault, it's your fault. You get the sin out of the camp. And of course they found Achan, who had stolen the stuff from Jericho, and you know the rest of the story. But the appeal here is, God, if you keep on punishing us and you keep us away from that land, pretty soon people are going to think you didn't have the power to carry out your will after all. And so for your glory and your name's honor, you need to bring us back. The prophet is never upbraided for approaching God with that. Now we may think that's a little perhaps arrogant on his part to say something like that to God, but God doesn't upbraid him for that. Yeah. And God didn't upbraid Joshua for saying that either. He just told Joshua there's sin in the camp. Anybody got any comments on 63 before we move into 64? You might actually get through. None of this is quoted in the Old Testament and applied to Jesus Christ and to the New Testament situation. So I would have to say that what is said here is probably only applicable to Israel directly. Now, the principles, they're timeless. As we said, from the beginning of time, we see these same principles over and over and over again. And so, from that standpoint, yeah, I would say there is some application to the New Testament times, but not directly.
History part of it.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Break from this for just a minute. How many of you are on Facebook? I get a little irritated sometimes when I see my friends on Facebook talking about how this wonderful thing happened to me. God is so good. And then their next post is, oh, what a bummer. I'm being so persecuted and so mistreated. And what is wrong with us? Really, what is wrong with us, Don? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll just give you a quick, mild example of this. I just joined the Rotary Club, and so I was doing some studying on how it began and all that kind of stuff. And a young man in Chicago who was lonely He was up there all by himself, no family, no real friends. Got together with 3 other businessmen in one of them's office. And the way the name of the club started was they were going to rotate their meeting place every week to a different person's office. And they started this little club just to get together and make friends, because they were all lonely. They didn't have anybody. And before the year ended, the club was so large that it was not practical to rotate the meeting place anymore. And then they decided they needed some kind of a mission other than just getting together and enjoying each other's company. And so they decided to be a service organization. And now you know how Rotary Club began. That's the basis of it. And so, thank God for loneliness. You know, when you think about it, loneliness that is dealt with properly, see what it started? You know, we ought to be thanking God for our adversities as well as the good times. Because oftentimes what God is doing is He is steering us in the path that He wants us to go by adversity. He did that to Israel. He brought them out of Canaan with a famine. Well, I'm sure they didn't understand what was going on. Why is God doing this to us? And they went down to Egypt, where they were able to multiply until the point where God then caused them to go into slavery in Egypt, because now it's time to go back to Canaan. And you see, God used adversity to get them to where He wanted them to be. Don. And when you look at what's happening to God's people here in Isaiah 63 and 64, and the trials that they were undergoing, some of these things that people today consider to be trials and tribulations, sometimes I just like to pick them up and slap them. It's nothing. You know, oh, I didn't get my new car that I wanted. That's so awful. So what? You have an old car to drive, don't you? You know, let's move on. Chapter 64. Somebody read verses 1 through 5.
Oh, that you would grant did awesome things He remembers you in your name.
Okay. This again is an appeal on behalf of God's former mercies to them for Him to continue those, I guess would be the nutshell of what's being said in these verses. Oh, that you would rend the heavens. What did God do when Christ died, basically? Remember what was rent into? Veil of the temple. Rent in two. God showed His mighty power. The graves were opened and the dead came forth and they talked to people. And, you know, my Uncle Abraham or Uncle Isaac or whoever was, you know, they've been dead 20 years and they've come back. Somehow I wonder if they really wanted to. I'm sure it was temporary. Yes, Jenna. Mount Sinai, too, is another one where what happened when they came to Mount Sinai? The mountain started quaking and shaking. God told Moses initially, you shall be a kingdom of priests, meaning every man was going to be a priest. Every man would have direct access to God. Then they saw that mountain shaking. The earth trembled. The loud noises happened. And then they turned to Moses and they said, "Oh no, Moses, you go talk to God. If we talk to Him, we'll die." Well, God made His presence known, and they realized just how insignificant They were. When they stood next to God. And so they had the sacerdotal priesthood then for them. And he's saying here again, basically, yeah, I think Jenna probably does have it right here. This is probably more of a reference. This is probably a reference to Mount Sinai. Oh God, that you would come down and just make your presence known to the whole world. Since the beginning of the world, in verse 4, men have not heard nor perceived by the ear. Every now and then he's saying, God, we just need a reminder of your presence. We need to see something. We need to hear something. We need to get kicked in our backside once in a while by you. Okay. And of course then the succeeding verses from that talk about how man put that knowledge of God away from them and how they just went downward spiral into sin. And just down, down, down. Until it got worse and worse. In verse 5, essentially what's being said here is, you're angry, we know, and you're justly angry, because we're the ones who sinned. But I'm asking you, Lord, or we're asking you, to please redeem us in spite of our unworthiness. Read verses 6 and 7, someone.
All of us become like one, all our righteous deeds are like filthy garments. All of us wither like a leaf. There's no one who calls on the Lord. Who rouses himself.
Okay. This is, again, just an argument from the fact that there are none that are righteous, that it's our iniquities that have caused us to be separated from you, and it's through no fault of yours that we don't have your praise. Again, just a humble statement, we're unworthy. And what did Paul say about us if we do all that God has commanded us to perfection? What are we? One of those wide open questions. We're unworthy servants because all we've done is what we should have done. We're not worthy really of any honor or praise or anything because we've just done what we should have. But we've all sinned and come short of the glory of God. Verses 8 through 12. Someone read that and we'll finish this. Huh? Thank you.
But now, O Lord, thou art our Father, and thou, all of us are the has become a good.
He begins here by saying, again, you're the potter, we're the clay. When is it that men usually turn to God? Is it on the mountaintops of glory or is it in the valleys of despair? I'm told, a friend of mine was on an airplane and the pilot came on and they were having some kind of trouble and the pilot said, prepare to crash. They were way up high in the air and the plane was coming down. And he said, you never heard the like of praying and religion that all of a sudden everybody on that plane got. He said, well, they got the trouble solved before they crashed, and they were able then to land safely at the nearest airport. But he said, people that were cursing and swearing and telling ribald jokes and all of this, while they were waiting to get on the plane, all of a sudden became the most holy, pious people in the world. Lord, just get me out of this and I'll serve you all the days of my life. And then he said a couple of them he heard after they got off the plane, they were back to their cursing and swearing. And boy, that was a really scary time. And, on with life. Forget about God. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 27 through 29, God spoke to the people, and Moses is speaking to them and saying, you need to obey the Lord. And the people came back and said, we will do all the words of the Lord. In verse 29, God says to Moses, oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me and keep all my commandments always, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. God says, I know they don't mean it. They're caught up in the emotion of the moment, and they're saying it now, but they don't really mean it. I know that. Verse 9 is a plea here again. Again, the theme is repeated. Pleading for forgiveness, even though we know we don't deserve it. And a parallel passage there, we're running out of time, but Jeremiah 36 and verse 3. And then verses 9 through 12 is a parallel to Psalm 74. You might write that if you're taking notes on verses 9 through 12. This is basically an argument from the idea that if God does not deliver them in some manner, that God's name is going to be forgotten among men. And so for His own glory, His own honor, He needs to redeem His people. Thank you very much.